Imagine waking up tomorrow in feudal Japan. Not as a samurai, not as a noble, not even as a merchant. You wake up as a peasant, which means you own nothing. You earn almost nothing. And legally, someone with a sword can kill you for showing the wrong kind of respect. Your job is simple: grow rice, pay taxes, and try not to starve when the harvest fails. Oh, and if your lord decides he needs soldiers this year, congratulations. You're now marching toward a battlefield with a bamboo spear and about 3 minutes of training. This is your life now, and the odds that you survive it are not good. You think your life is hard? You think waking up at 7 a.m. to sit in an air-conditioned office and stare at a screen for 8 hours while sipping coffee from a ceramic mug shaped like a cartoon cat is suffering? That's adorable. Truly. Because somewhere in the mist-covered rice paddies of feudal Japan, a version of you exists that would trade everything, every single thing they own, which isn't much, for the privilege of your worst Monday. Let's set the scene. It's roughly the year 1500, the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. Japan is tearing itself apart like a wet paper lantern in a typhoon. Warlords are battling warlords. Samurai are cutting each other down in muddy fields over territory, honor, and occasionally just because someone looked at someone else's horse the wrong way. And somewhere beneath all of that chaos, beneath the clashing steel, the political scheming, and the burning castles on distant hilltops, there's you, a peasant, a nobody, a warm body, whose sole purpose in the grand machinery of Japanese feudalism is to grow rice, shut your mouth, and die quietly when the time comes. And the time could come at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all. You didn't choose this life. Nobody chooses to be born at the bottom of a rigid social hierarchy so calcified and absolute that the mere idea of upward mobility would get you laughed out of the village, or worse. In feudal Japan, society was divided into a strict caste system. At the top sat the emperor, a figurehead wrapped in silk and ceremony, followed by the shogun, the actual military ruler pulling every string that mattered. Below them were the daimyo, the regional warlords, and their loyal samurai, the warrior class who lived by the Bushido code and carried 2 swords as a constant reminder that they could end your existence on a whim. And then, beneath all of that shimmering aristocracy and martial prestige, buried under layers of obligation and oppression, was you, the farmer, the peasant, the foundation upon which the entire system was built, and the one who benefited from it the least. Congratulations, you are the mud beneath the boot, and that boot is about to start stomping. Your alarm clock is the sun, not the gentle golden sunrise you see in travel brochures, but a harsh, unforgiving light that signals the beginning of another 14 to 16-hour day of backbreaking labor. You rise from your futon, which is less of a futon and more of a thin mat on a hard floor in a one-room wooden hut that you share with your entire family. The smell is something you stopped noticing years ago. A cocktail of sweat, smoke, damp straw, and the lingering presence of whatever livestock is penned up uncomfortably close to your sleeping quarters. Breakfast is rice, if you're lucky. If the harvest was decent and the local lord didn't take more than his usual cut, you might have a small portion of barley or millet mixed in. Maybe some pickled vegetables if the season allowed it. Meat, forget it. Buddhism's influence on Japanese culture discouraged the consumption of 4-legged animals for centuries. And even if it didn't, you couldn't afford it anyway. Fish was occasionally available if you lived near a river or coastline. But for most inland peasants, protein was a rare luxury reserved for festivals or the kind of desperate circumstances where you'd eat anything that moved. After your modest meal, you head to the fields. Rice cultivation in feudal Japan was not a casual weekend gardening hobby. It was an all-consuming, body-destroying endeavor that demanded precision, endurance, and an intimate familiarity with suffering. The paddies had to be flooded, plowed, planted, weeded, and harvested entirely by hand. You stood knee-deep in muddy water for hours under a sun that seemed personally offended by your existence, bending and stooping until your spine curved into a shape that would make a modern chiropractor weep openly. Insects feasted on your exposed skin. Leeches attached themselves to your legs with quiet determination. Your feet developed calluses so thick they could deflect a blade. And you did this every single day. Because the alternative was starvation. And starvation was always just one bad season away. But the physical toll was only part of the equation. The emotional and psychological weight of peasant life was its own unique flavor of torment. You worked the land, but you didn't own it. Every grain of rice you coaxed from the earth was subject to taxation by your local daimyo, and those taxes were brutal. Peasants were typically required to surrender anywhere from 40 to 60% of their harvest. In some regions, and under particularly greedy lords, that number climbed even higher. You grew the food, you tended the crops, you sacrificed your health and your youth in the service of agriculture. And then you handed over more than half of everything to a man in a castle who had never once felt soil between his fingers. If the harvest was good, you survived. If the harvest was bad, you starved. And either way, the lord still expected his share. Here's a detail about feudal Japan that doesn't get mentioned enough in the romanticized samurai epics and beautifully animated period dramas. Samurai had a legal right called kiri-sute-gomen, which roughly translates to permission to cut and leave. This was exactly as terrifying as it sounds. If a samurai felt that a commoner, that's you by the way, had behaved disrespectfully, they were legally permitted to strike you down on the spot. No trial, no investigation, no paperwork. Just steel through flesh, and a body in the road. What constituted disrespect? Well, that was largely up to the samurai's interpretation, which is a polite way of saying it was completely arbitrary. Maybe you didn't bow quickly enough. Maybe you accidentally made eye contact. Maybe you were walking on the wrong side of the road, or your shadow fell across a samurai's path at an angle he found personally insulting. The rules were vague because they were designed to be. Ambiguity kept peasants terrified, and terrified peasants are obedient peasants. But kiri-sute-gomen wasn't even the worst of it. There existed a practice called tsujigiri, or crossroads killing. This was when a samurai, typically one who had recently acquired a new sword, would venture out at night to test the blade's sharpness on a live human target. And who made for the most convenient and least consequential target? You guessed it. A peasant wandering home after a long day in the fields. Some historians debate how widespread this practice truly was, and it was technically illegal during certain periods. But the fact that it existed at all, that there was a recognized term for the casual murder of commoners as a form of product testing, tells you everything you need to know about where peasants ranked in the social equation. You weren't a person, you were a testing surface, a melon with a pulse. Walking home after dark wasn't just inadvisable, it was genuinely life-threatening. And not because of bandits or wild animals, though those were real dangers too, but because someone with a fancy new katana might want to see if it could cut through a human torso in a single stroke. The answer, by the way, was almost always yes. As if the social hierarchy wasn't punishing enough. The geography of Japan itself seemed specifically engineered to make peasant life as miserable as possible. The Japanese archipelago sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire, one of the most seismically active zones on the planet. Earthquakes were a regular occurrence, capable of leveling entire villages in seconds. Wooden huts and thatched roofs offered zero structural resistance to a serious tremor. One moment you're sleeping, the next moment your house is on top of you. And if the earthquake didn't kill you, the resulting tsunami might, particularly for coastal communities that had no warning systems, no seawalls, and no understanding of plate tectonics. Typhoons battered the islands annually, bringing catastrophic winds and flooding that could obliterate an entire season's harvest in a single night. Months of painstaking labor, of wading through flooded paddies and nursing fragile rice shoots into maturity, all wiped out by a storm that arrived without mercy and left without apology. And remember, your lord still expected his taxes paid in full. A destroyed harvest wasn't his problem, it was yours. You either found a way to pay, or you faced consequences ranging from imprisonment to execution. Volcanic eruptions added another layer of existential dread. Japan has over 100 active volcanoes, and major eruptions could blanket agricultural land in ash, poisoning the soil and rendering it useless for years. Famine wasn't an occasional inconvenience in feudal Japan. It was a recurring apocalypse. Major famines struck with devastating regularity, killing tens of thousands, and sometimes hundreds of thousands at a time. During the worst of these famines, peasants resorted to eating bark, roots, insects, and in the most desperate and horrifying cases, each other. Cannibalism during famine periods is documented in Japanese historical records, and while it was rare, its very existence speaks to the absolute extremity of suffering that peasants endured. Disease followed famine the way thunder follows lightning. Weakened immune systems and cramped, unsanitary living conditions created perfect breeding grounds for epidemics. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, and various parasitic infections swept through peasant communities with grim regularity. Medical care was essentially non-existent for the lower classes. Treatments consisted of herbal remedies passed down through generations, spiritual rituals performed by local monks or shamans, and a whole lot of hoping for the best. If you got seriously ill, you either recovered on your own or you didn't recover at all. There was no middle ground. The Sengoku period, spanning roughly from 1467 to 1615, was a century and a half of near-constant military conflict. Warlords fought for dominance. Alliances shifted like sand dunes. Entire regions changed hands through bloody conquest, and at the very center of this meat grinder, conscripted against their will and armed with weapons they barely knew how to use, were the peasants. When a daimyo needed soldiers, he took them from the fields. Your farming experience didn't matter. Your physical condition didn't matter. Your opinion certainly didn't matter. You were handed a spear, maybe given some rudimentary instruction on which end to point at the enemy, and marched toward a battlefield where trained samurai on both sides would cut through conscripted peasants like a scythe through wheat. Ashigaru, the foot soldiers drawn from the peasant class, were cannon fodder in the most literal sense possible once firearms arrived in Japan in 1543. They stood in the front lines, absorbing the initial charge, soaking up arrows and bullets so that the more valuable samurai units behind them could engage the enemy under more favorable conditions. If you survived the battle, you returned to your fields, assuming they hadn't been burned or trampled during the conflict. If your lord won, life continued as usual, which is to say, miserably. If your lord lost, you now served a new master whose policies might be even harsher than the last. Either way, you had no agency, no voice, no choice. You were a resource to be spent, and feudal Japan spent its peasants with reckless abandon. Desertion was punishable by death. Cowardice was punishable by death. Surrender was considered so shameful that death was often preferable, at least according to the warrior class who made the rules but rarely suffered their consequences. A peasant soldier who fled the battlefield might be hunted down and executed as an example to others. The message was clear. You fight when told, you die when told, and you do both without complaint. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of peasant life in feudal Japan was its permanence. The social hierarchy wasn't just rigid, it was hereditary. You were born a peasant, you lived as a peasant, and you died as a peasant. Your children would be peasants. Their children would be peasants. The system was designed to be inescapable, a closed loop of generational suffering with no exit and no appeal. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of the great unifiers of Japan, formalized this in the late 1500s with a series of edicts that effectively froze the social classes in place. Peasants were forbidden from carrying weapons, a decree enforced through nationwide sword hunts that stripped villages of anything that could be used for resistance or self-defense. They were forbidden from leaving their land without permission. They were forbidden from changing occupations. The walls of their cage were built from law, tradition, and the ever-present threat of violence. And those walls had no doors. Education was a fantasy. Literacy was almost non-existent among the peasant class. The written word was the domain of monks, scholars, and the aristocracy. A peasant who could read was about as common as a samurai who could plow a field, which is to say, virtually unheard of. Without education, without mobility, without rights, and without weapons, the peasant class existed in a state of perpetual subjugation so thorough that most never even conceived of an alternative. This was simply how the world worked. The sky was above, the earth was below, and you were somewhere underneath the earth, digging. Occasionally, the pressure became too much. Peasant uprisings, called Ikki, did occur throughout feudal Japanese history. Desperate farmers, pushed beyond the breaking point by excessive taxation, famine, or the casual brutality of their rulers, would band together and revolt. Some of these uprisings were surprisingly successful in the short term, forcing local lords to temporarily reduce taxes or address specific grievances. But the long-term outcome was almost always the same. The rebellion would be crushed. Its leaders would be publicly executed in spectacularly gruesome fashion, and the surviving peasants would return to their fields carrying the fresh memory of what happens when the bottom tries to challenge the top. You were born into a machine that fed on your labor and your silence. It asked everything of you, and gave almost nothing in return. It worked you until your body broke, taxed you until your stores ran empty, conscripted you until the battlefield swallowed you whole. And if by some miracle you survived all of that, it ensured your children would endure the exact same fate. So no, you wouldn't survive as a peasant in feudal Japan. Not because you're weak, not because you're lazy, not because you lack some mythical, ancient toughness that modern life has softened out of you. You wouldn't survive because the system was specifically designed to extract every ounce of value from your existence while giving you just barely enough to keep breathing so you could do it all again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that, until one day, you simply couldn't anymore. And when that day came, nobody noticed. Nobody mourned. They just put someone else in the field and kept the machine running. Sweet dreams. And the next time you complain about waking up at 7 a.m. for work, just remember, at least nobody can legally cut you in half on the way there.